The silence in the house wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a presence. A heavy, breathing thing that filled the space Clara left behind 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days ago. Mark felt it pressing against his eardrums, thick as wool, especially on these crisp October afternoons. Golden, slanting light cut through the dusty bay window of the living room, illuminating the motes dancing over sheet-draped furniture. Only the piano stood uncovered, a dark, scarred upright holding its ground against the pervasive melancholy. Outside, the scent of damp earth and distant burning leaves hung in the cool air, a bittersweet reminder of a world continuing its turn. Inside, Mark stood by the window, not seeing the autumn colors, but the ghostly reflection of the room behind him, the covered sofa Clara loved, the blank spaces where her vibrant paintings once shouted color, the silent piano. His tea, long gone cold, was forgotten in his hands. At 42, he felt ancient, a composer whose music had dried up with his wife's last breath. He'd retreated from teaching, from life, existing within these walls, a ghost haunting his own grief. The ache was bone deep, soul deep, a fundamental part of him now. He moved through days, not living them. He wasn't entirely alone. 3 months prior, on a rain-lashed night, a sodden shadow had pressed against the back door, meowing with a voice like rusted hinges. A flicker of something other than grief, perhaps simple recognition of another lost soul, made Mark open the door. A streak of matted gray fur darted in, vanishing under the claw-footed bathtub for 2 days. He'd left food, water, spoken soft words near the bathroom door, words meant for the cat or perhaps just to fracture the crushing silence. When she finally emerged, it was with a wariness that mirrored his own. Small, scrawny, her fur the color of storm clouds, she had one cloudy, milky blue eye that gave her a perpetually quizzical, slightly lost look, and one startlingly clear amber eye, watchful and intelligent. A thin, pale scar sliced through the fur above the good eye, a faded punctuation mark in her unknown story. He named her Whisper for the sound she rarely made, and for the quiet she seemed to understand. She didn't purr loudly or demand affection. She existed on the periphery, watching him from the bookcase with that mismatched gaze, curling into a tight gray ball on Clara's favored armchair. Her presence was a quiet counterpoint to the screaming absence. Mark talked to her sometimes, filling the quiet without expecting answers. "Another gray day, Whisper," he'd murmur. Or, staring at the covered piano, "I don't know if I can, girl. Not without her." Whisper would just blink slowly, her good amber eye holding his for a moment before tucking her nose under her tail. That particular October afternoon, the silence felt like a physical weight on Mark's chest. He'd been avoiding the piano for weeks, circling it like a sleeping beast. But today, the quiet roared. He set the cold mug down with a soft clink that echoed too loudly. His feet carried him towards the piano almost against his will. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the dusty sheet covering it. Beneath the sheet lay Clara's favorite emerald green shawl, folded neatly on the lid. He couldn't bring himself to move it. Instead, he lifted the heavy fallboard. The familiar scent of aged wood and ivory dust filled his nostrils, a scent that smelled like before, like possibility, like her. He sank onto the worn bench, the leather cool beneath him. The silence intensified. He stared at the yellowed keys, feeling utterly hollow. What was the point? The music was gone. She was gone. His fingers, calloused from years of playing, settled on the cool ivory by muscle memory. Not a melody, not chords, just isolated notes. C, D. He let them hang in the air, pure, simple vibrations dissolving into the quiet. He played another. It was the sound of emptiness, of searching. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool wood above the keys, fighting the familiar tightening in his throat. His fingers found a slow, simple minor chord progression, C minor, a major, F minor. The sound was thick with unshed tears. He held the last F minor chord, letting it fade into the stillness. And then he heard it. Not the settling house. Not the distant wind. From the armchair, where Whisper had been a silent gray lump, came a soft, hesitant sound. Not a meow. Not a purr. It was a low, slightly raspy, vibrating tone. A hum. Moo. It rose and fell, almost perfectly matching the pitch of the fading F minor chord. Mark froze, his head snapping up. Whisper was sitting upright now, ears pricked forward, her cloudy blue eye and clear amber eye fixed intently on him, or perhaps on the piano. Her tiny chest vibrated visibly. She opened her mouth slightly, and the sound came again clearer. Tentative. Musical. A response. Mark's breath caught. The heavy grief in his chest shifted, just a fraction. Not gone, but pierced by something utterly unexpected. A spark of pure, bewildered wonder. He slowly, carefully, pressed the F minor chord again. Dum-dum-dum. And from the armchair, like a tiny, rusty echo, it wasn't harmony. Not yet. It was raw, strange, and utterly, profoundly alive. In the vast silence of his grief, Mark had played a note, and the silent cat had answered. He stared at Whisper, her mismatched eyes wide and focused. The quiet in the room hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It wasn't just emptiness anymore. It was anticipation. It was the fragile, impossible beginning of a conversation. A conversation in notes between a broken man and a scarred, one-eyed cat. And in that moment, though he couldn't have explained it, Mark felt a tiny, almost forgotten thread of connection tugging, not just to the cat, but to the world outside his pain. Something small and impossibly important had just stirred in the dusty golden light. He lifted his hands back to the keys, his heart pounding a strange, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. He played a single, clear G, and waited. The G note hung in the air, pure and expectant. Mark held his breath, fingers hovering over the keys, his gaze locked on Whisper. The gray cat remained upright on the armchair, her scarred brow furrowed in concentration, her mismatched eyes wide and unblinking. The silence stretched, thin and taut. For a disorienting second, Mark wondered if he'd imagined it all, the low, answering hum to his chord. A trick of the wind, or his grief-stricken mind conjuring connections where none existed. Then softly, hesitantly, it wasn't the G. It was lower, wavering slightly, perhaps an attempt at the E below it. Or maybe just her own voice finding its way. The sound, imperfect but undeniably there, vibrated through the quiet room. It was the most astonishing thing Mark had heard in nearly a year. Not a symphony, not even a tune, but a response. A fragile thread cast back to him across the void of his solitude. He didn't dare move. He played the G again. Sustained. Whisper tilted her head, her good amber eye narrowing slightly. A questioning lilt this time, ending higher. Closer to the G, but not quite. It was like listening to someone learn a language by ear, syllable by syllable. A laugh bubbled up in Mark's chest, surprising him. It felt rusty, unfamiliar, catching in his throat and emerging as a choked sound halfway between a sob and a chuckle. He lowered his hands from the keys, resting them in his lap. Whisper watched him, unblinking. He slowly reached out a hand, palm up, towards the space between the piano and the armchair. Not demanding, just offering. Whisper stared at the hand. Her tail twitched once, a slow metronome beat against the worn upholstery. She didn't flee back under the chair, but she didn't approach either. The moment stretched. Mark lowered his hand. "Okay, Whisper," he murmured, the name feeling more real on his lips now. Figure this out." That afternoon marked the beginning of a new, fragile rhythm in the silent house. The heavy grief didn't vanish. It remained, a constant ache, a familiar weight in Mark's chest when he woke to the gray October light filtering through the curtains. But now, woven through the sorrow, was a thread of bewildered curiosity. A reason to get out of bed that wasn't just obligation to his own survival or to the silent cat who depended on him. He started with the basics. Routine. He began making coffee again, properly, not just reheating yesterday's sludge. The bitter aroma filled the kitchen, a scent that used to signal mornings with Clara, discussing lesson plans or humming snippets of melodies. Now it signaled possibility. He'd pour 2 mugs out of habit, then catch himself, setting one aside untouched. But Whisper would appear, weaving figure eights around his ankles as he stood at the counter, her tail brushing his pajama pants. She'd watch, her head tilted, as he stirred sugar into his own mug. Sometimes, she'd let out a tiny, inquisitive MRP. When the spoon clinked against the ceramic, he started talking to her more. Not just filling the silence, but actually sharing. Small things at first. "Looks like rain again, doesn't it?" he'd say, glancing out the kitchen window at the leaden sky. Or, "Need to remember to buy more of those fishy biscuits you like." He'd find her perched on the back of the sofa, watching the birds flit through the barren branches of the oak tree in the yard. "Sparrows today," he'd observe, standing beside her. "Busy little things." She'd flick an ear towards his voice but keep her gaze fixed outside, a silent companion in observation. The piano became their meeting point. Not every day and never for long at first. Mark's fingers still felt stiff, clumsy, the connection between his heart and the music severed. But the memory of Whisper's answering hum pulled him back to the bench. He'd lift the fallboard, the scent of wood and dust a familiar embrace, and play single notes. Simple scales. Ascending, descending. C major. G major. He'd watch Whisper. Her reactions were subtle, fascinating. She rarely sang immediately. Sometimes she'd just sit on the armchair, cleaning a paw with intense focus, seemingly oblivious. Other times, she'd jump down and pad silently across the rug, settling near the piano's legs, just out of reach. She'd curl up, tucking her paws under her, her mismatched eyes fixed on his hands, or perhaps on the vibrations humming through the wood. She seemed to be listening, deeply, attentively, not like a pet waiting for attention, but like a fellow musician absorbing the sound. Then, unpredictably, she'd chime in. It wasn't always on pitch. Sometimes it was a low, rumbling growl-like sound if he played a particularly dissonant chord. Sometimes it was a high-pitched, almost chirping mew if he hit a bright, high note. But often, especially with sustained, clear notes in the middle register, she'd produce that low, resonant hum. She'd hold it as long as he held the note, her little chest vibrating visibly. When he stopped, she'd stop. Silence. Waiting. He started experimenting. He'd play a note, wait for her hum, then play another note a third or a fifth above it. Sometimes, miraculously, she'd shift her pitch, attempting to match the new note. It was rough, untrained, instinctive. But the intent was clear. She wasn't just making noise, she was interacting. Communicating in the only way she seemed to know how. With sound. With vibration. Mark found himself smiling. Genuine, if fleeting, smiles that felt strange on his face. He'd catch his reflection in the dark window glass while playing a simple melody, something light, like a folk tune Clara used to sing, and see the ghost of someone he used to be. Someone less burdened. And beside him, or near his feet, Whisper would be a small, gray shape, her eyes closed, her humming a quiet counterpoint. The sound was oddly soothing. Not beautiful in a conventional sense, but deeply real. It filled the spaces the silence used to occupy with something alive. Present. He began to notice her small gestures of trust. One chilly afternoon, as rain lashed against the windows, Mark sat on the floor near the radiator, leaning back against the wall, sketching idly in an old notebook, not music, just shapes, lines, trying to quiet his mind. Whisper, after circling the room twice, approached cautiously. She stopped a few feet away, sniffed the air, then slowly, deliberately, closed her eyes in a long, slow blink. Mark remembered reading somewhere that this was a cat's way of showing trust, affection. He blinked slowly back at her. She did it again. Then, with a small sigh, she padded closer, circled once, and settled down beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her small body and hear the soft rumble of her purr, a sound she rarely made loudly. It was a quiet engine of contentment. He didn't move, didn't reach out, just let her presence sink in. The steady purr, the warmth, the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing beside his leg, it was a profound comfort. A shared peace in the storm. He started sharing more than just the weather. Sitting at the piano one gray morning, his fingers stumbling over a Chopin prelude Clara had adored, the familiar wave of grief crashed over him. It wasn't the sharp, stabbing pain of the early days, but a deep, drowning sorrow. His hands fell still on the discordant keys. He bowed his head, resting his forehead on the cool wood above the keyboard, the unshed tears burning behind his eyes. "I miss her, Whisper," he whispered, the words thick. "God, I miss her so much it still steals the breath from my lungs." He didn't expect an answer. Didn't need one. Just the act of saying it aloud, to this quiet witness, felt like releasing a tiny fraction of the pressure. A soft thump. Then, the gentle pressure of a small paw on his thigh. He lifted his head. Whisper had jumped onto the piano bench beside him. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, her posture alert. But her paw rested lightly on his leg. Not demanding, not needing. Just a grounding touch. A silent acknowledgement. "I'm here. You are not alone." He covered her small paw with his large, calloused hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath the soft fur. She didn't pull away. She just sat, a small, solid presence beside him in the vast ocean of his grief. He took a shuddering breath. The tears didn't fall, but the tightness in his chest eased, just a fraction. He played a single, clear whisper, her paw still resting on his leg, tilted her head back and hummed. It wasn't a happy sound. It resonated with the sorrow in the room. But it was shared. It was connection. Their bond deepened through shared silence as much as sound. Evenings found them in a new routine. Mark would read on the sofa, a book propped on his knees, a single lamp casting a pool of warm light. Whisper, after her post-dinner patrol of the windowsills, would often leap onto the sofa. Not onto his lap yet, but onto the cushion beside him. She'd curl into a compact circle, tucking her nose under her tail, her good amber eyes sometimes open, watching the pages turn, sometimes closed in rest. The silence between them wasn't the oppressive silence of before. It was companionable, filled with the soft sounds of turning pages, the occasional crackle from the radiator, and Whisper's deep, rhythmic breathing. He'd glance down at her, this small creature who had entered his life like a shadow and was gradually becoming a source of light, however faint. He'd noticed the way the lamplight caught the silver tips in her storm-gray fur, the quiet dignity in her scarred, mismatched face. She carried her own history in her wary eyes and that thin, pale scar, a history he knew nothing about. Yet here she was, choosing to share his silence, his space, his grief. He began to see reflections of himself in her. The wariness, the quiet withdrawal, the way she flinched at sudden loud noises, a dropped book, a car backfiring outside. He understood that flinch. The world felt too loud, too sharp sometimes. He saw her fierce independence, her meticulous cleaning rituals, the way she'd stalk an invisible prey across the rug, but also her moments of startling vulnerability. Like the time she'd been startled by a delivery truck's beeping and had bolted under the bed, refusing to come out for hours. He'd sat on the floor near the bed, talking softly, not coaxing, just letting her know he was there. Eventually, she'd emerged, blinking slowly, and had rubbed her head against his outstretched hand with a force that felt like gratitude. It mirrored his own need for solitude, his own recoil from the well-meaning but overwhelming condolences of friends, his own tentative steps back towards the world, anchored by her quiet presence. One crisp November morning, a Saturday, Mark decided to try something different. Instead of scales or isolated notes, he played a simple, slow melody. A lullaby. One his own grandmother used to sing, its notes gentle and flowing. He played it softly, letting the phrases breathe. He wasn't watching Whisper. He was lost in the simple beauty of the tune, the memory of his grandmother's voice warm in his mind. He felt her before he heard her. A shift in the air near his leg. Then the softest pressure on his knee. He glanced down. Whisper had jumped onto the piano bench and was standing beside him, her front paws planted on his thigh for balance, her head tilted back, her gaze fixed somewhere near the piano's soundboard. As the melody rose to a gentle peak, she opened her mouth. Not a hum this time. It was a sound he hadn't heard from her before. A clear, sustained, almost melodic. It wavered slightly, finding its pitch, but it flowed with the music, matching the contour of the phrase he was playing. It wasn't mimicking individual notes, it was singing along, trying to be part of the song. Mark's fingers faltered for only a second, then found their way again, his heart pounding not with grief, but with a fierce, protective joy. He kept playing, softer now, letting her voice weave with the pianos. Her sound was raspy, untrained, utterly unique. But it was beautiful. To him, in that moment, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was trust. It was vulnerability. It was a small, scarred creature offering the only gift she had, her voice, back to him. When the last note faded, Whisper lowered her head. She blinked up at him, her amber eye wide, almost questioning. Then, without preamble, she butted her head firmly against his hand where it rested on the keys. A gentle head bonk. A cat's kiss. Mark's vision blurred. He carefully scooped her up, cradling her small, warm body against his chest. She didn't struggle. She tucked her head under his chin, her purr erupting, loud, rumbling and deep, vibrating against his sternum. He held her, this small miracle of fur and sound, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his own. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of purrs, full of shared breath, full of a connection that felt deeper than words, deeper than music. It was the quiet hum of healing, fragile but undeniably real, resonating in the space between a man's shattered heart and a cat's answering song. He knew, then, that this wasn't just about the music. It was about the quiet moments in between. The shared glances, the slow blinks, the weight of a paw on his leg in a moment of despair, the warmth of her curled beside him as he read. Whisper wasn't replacing Clara, that was impossible. But she was stitching something back together inside him, thread by fragile thread, with purrs and hums and quiet companionship. She was teaching him how to breathe again, note by hesitant note. And as he held her, feeling the rumble against his chest, Mark realized the silence he'd been drowning in was finally beginning to recede, replaced by the soft, living symphony of a one-eyed cat who sang along. The shared song, the head bonk, the rumbling purr against his chest, it felt like a fragile new language blooming in the silence. Mark carried the warmth of that moment with him for days. He found himself humming the lullaby while washing dishes. He caught himself smiling absently at Whisper as she meticulously groomed herself in a patch of weak November sun on the rug. The grief hadn't vanished. It was still a deep, cold current running beneath his days. But now there was this counterpoint, a small, gray creature weaving threads of connection, note by note, purr by purr. Their musical sessions became a cherished ritual. Not daily, never forced, but whenever the quiet felt too heavy or a shaft of unexpected sunlight made the dust motes dance, Mark would find himself drawn to the piano. He'd play simple melodies, folk tunes, fragments of classical pieces, even hesitant attempts at composing something new, something soft and minor-keyed that echoed his internal landscape. And Whisper listened. Her participation wasn't constant, but when it came, it was transformative. Sometimes she'd just sit near the piano legs, eyes closed, absorbing the vibrations. Other times, she'd jump onto the bench beside him, resting her chin on his thigh, her mismatched eyes fixed on his moving hands. And then, unpredictably, she'd open her mouth and sing. Not always matching the melody note for note, but weaving her own strange, rasping harmony, following the rise and fall of the phrases, her voice a raw, living instrument resonating in the old house. To Mark, it was pure, unadulterated magic. A private concert, a shared secret. One frosty Tuesday afternoon, Mark was lost in a particularly melancholic improvisation. The notes were slow, minor, searching. Whisper sat on the rug nearby, washing a paw with intense concentration. As the music swelled into a slightly dissonant chord cluster, a reflection of the unresolved ache he still carried, Whisper suddenly stopped grooming. Her head snapped up. Her ears flattened back, not in fear, but in intense focus. She stared past Mark, past the piano, towards the closed door leading to the hallway and the seldom-used front parlor. Her cloudy blue eyes seemed to glaze over slightly, while her amber eye sharpened, fixed on something unseen. A low growl rumbled deep in her chest, entirely different from her singing hum. It was a sound Mark had never heard from her, primal, warning. He stopped playing mid-chord. "Whisper?" he murmured, following her gaze. Nothing. Just the closed door, the empty hallway beyond. The sudden silence felt charged, brittle. Whisper remained rigid, her gaze locked on the doorway, the low growl continuing, vibrating through her small frame. Mark felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. It was so unlike her. She wasn't a skittish cat, not anymore. Sudden noises might startle her, but this was focused intensity. Almost recognition? "Hey," he said softly, pushing the piano bench back. He crouched down near her, extending a hand slowly. "What is it, girl? What do you see?" Her gaze flickered to him for a fraction of a second, but snapped back to the doorway. The growl subsided into a tense silence, her body coiled tight. After a long minute, she blinked slowly, shook her head as if clearing it, and resumed washing her paw, but her movements were jerky, distracted. The moment passed, leaving behind a residue of disquiet Mark couldn't shake. He tried playing again, but the magic was broken. The notes felt hollow. Whisper didn't sing. The unease lingered. Mark found himself glancing towards the hallway door more often. He started noticing other things. Small things. Whisper, who usually followed him everywhere, to the kitchen, the bathroom, curling up near him wherever he settled, began avoiding the front parlor altogether. If he opened the door and walked in, she'd linger at the threshold, tail twitching, refusing to cross. She'd stare into the dim, dusty room with that same unnerving focus, then turn and pad silently away. Then came the scratching. It started subtly. Late at night, as Mark lay reading in bed, Whisper curled beside him, he'd hear it. Not the usual scratching at the door to be let out or in. This was different. Furtive. Persistent. A rhythmic, grating sound coming from somewhere down the hall. Near the front parlor. He'd get up, flashlight in hand, Whisper shadowing his steps, her ears pricked. He'd check the parlor door closed. He'd open it, sweep the beam across the room, Clara's old writing desk, the covered chaise longue, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the night. Nothing. The scratching would stop the moment he entered the hallway. Whisper would stand rigidly beside him, staring intently at the far wall of the parlor, the wall shared with the neighboring house. Silence would descend, thick and watchful. He'd return to bed, the scratching would start again 10 minutes later. It felt deliberate, taunting. He tried rationalizing it. Mice? But the house was old, and he'd never seen a single sign. Pipes settling? But it sounded too localized. Too rhythmic. Too much like claws on plaster. One night, fueled by frustration and lack of sleep, he crept down the hall silently, stopping just outside the parlor door. The scratching was clear now, coming from inside the parlor. Not near the door, but against the shared wall with the neighbor. Scritch, 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 scritch. He flung the door open. The scratching stopped instantly. The room was empty. Cold. Dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight. He walked to the wall where the sound had emanated. Nothing. Smooth plaster. He ran his hand over it. Unmarked. Behind him, Whisper sat in the doorway, a silent gray sentinel, watching him, her expression unreadable. The next day, the tension coiled tighter. Mark was in the kitchen, making lunch, when the doorbell rang. A sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet house. Whisper, who had been sunning herself on the windowsill, vanished instantly, a gray blur streaking under the sofa. Mark sighed, wiping his hands on a towel. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the front door to find Mrs. Henderson from next door standing on the porch. She was a sparrow of a woman, late 70s, with kind eyes magnified by thick glasses and a perpetually concerned expression. She'd lived next door for decades, longer than Mark and Clara had owned their house. She'd brought casseroles after Clara's passing, her eyes filled with genuine sympathy. "Mark, dear," she began, wringing her hands slightly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you?" "Not at all, Mrs. Henderson," Mark said, forcing a smile. "Come in? It's freezing out there." He ushered her into the relatively warmer hallway, leaving the front door slightly ajar. He noticed her gaze darting past him, into the dimness of the house, a flicker of something unease in her eyes. "Oh, no, I won't stay," she said quickly, her voice lowered. It's probably nothing. Silly, really." She hesitated, peering up at him through her thick lenses. Have you noticed anything odd lately?" Mark's pulse quickened. "Odd? How do you mean?" He kept his voice casual, but his mind flashed instantly to the scratching, to whispers staring, to the low growl. Mrs. Henderson leaned in conspiratorially, though they were alone. "It's probably just the wind, or the old pipes groaning, or perhaps that lovely cat of yours. She's quite vocal, isn't she?" Whisper. "She sings sometimes, yes," Mark admitted cautiously. "When I play the piano." Mrs. Henderson nodded vigorously. "Oh, I've heard. Through the walls, thin walls in these old places. It's unusual, isn't it? A singing cat." She gave a nervous little laugh. "Quite charming, really. But lately," she trailed off, her smile fading. "Lately, it sounded different." Different? Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the open door. "Yes." She lowered her voice further, almost to a whisper. "Not just the singing. Though that's changed too. Less tuneful? More like a moan. A low, sad sound. But that's not what made me come over." She took a shaky breath. "It's the scratching, Mark. At night. Coming from your front parlor. Against the wall we share." Mark's blood ran cold. So it wasn't just him. It wasn't his grief-addled imagination. "You hear it too?" The words came out hoarse. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes wide behind her glasses. "Distinctly. Every night this week. It wakes me up. It sounds frantic. And then the singing. Or the moaning. Right after it stops. Always right after." She shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter. "It gave me such a turn, Mark. Because, it reminded me." "Reminded you?" Mark prompted, his throat tight. "Of old Mrs. Abernathy," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "She lived here before you and Clara, dear. Lived here for 50 years. Lovely woman, but quiet. Very quiet." Her gaze drifted past Mark again, towards the closed parlor door. "She had a cat too. A big old ginger Tom. His name was Marmalade. He was her whole world after her husband passed. Doted on him." She paused, her expression clouded. "When Mrs. Abernathy, when she passed, it was in that front parlor. Very sudden. The stroke, they said. Poor Marmal. He was found curled up beside her. They say he wouldn't leave her side for days. Refused to eat. Just waited." Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to a thread. "And for weeks after, before the house was sold, I'd hear noises from in there. Scratching. And crying. Like a cat crying. Morning, I always thought." She met Mark's eyes, her own filled with a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. "I'd forgotten all about it until now. With the scratching. And your cat singing or moaning near that same wall." She patted his arm awkwardly. "Probably just nonsense, dear. Old houses make strange noises. And cats, they're mysterious creatures. But, I thought you should know." Mark stood frozen after Mrs. Henderson left, the cold air from the open door swirling around his ankles. Her words echoed in the suddenly oppressive silence of the hallway. "Old Mrs. Abernathy. Mom died in the parlor. It explained nothing. It deepened everything. Was Whisper sensing something? Reacting to the residual energy of a decades-old grief? Was the scratching just house noises amplified by his own anxiety and Mrs. Henderson's suggestive story? Or was it something else? Something tied to the wall itself? He looked down. Whisper had emerged from under the sofa and was sitting at his feet, staring intently at the closed parlor door. Her tail was low, the tip twitching slightly. She wasn't growling, but her posture was rigid, alert. Her mismatched eyes held an unnerving depth, as if she could see layers of history Mark couldn't perceive. The comfortable rhythm of his fragile healing shattered. The shared music, the purrs, the quiet companionship, they were still there, but now underpinned by a chilling undercurrent. The house felt different, less like a refuge, more like a vessel holding echoes. The front parlor, a room he'd largely avoided since Clara's death, now felt charged with an invisible presence. A question hung in the air, thick and cold as the November fog outside. What was behind that wall? Was it just old plaster and timber? Or was it something remembered? Something grieving? And why was his silent, singing cat so fixated on it? That night, the scratching started earlier. Scritch, 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 scritch. Relentless. Coming from the parlor wall. Mark lay in bed, rigid, listening. Whisper wasn't beside him. She was sitting outside the bedroom door, a dark silhouette in the hallway, facing the direction of the parlor. Silent. Watching. Waiting. The sound seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, into his bones. It wasn't just noise anymore. It felt like a demand, a plea, or a warning. The cozy bubble of their shared existence had been pierced by the eerie, the unexplained. The haunting wasn't of ghosts, perhaps, but of grief, both his own and the long-ago grief embedded in the very walls. And Whisper, his anchor, his unexpected duet partner, was now his silent guide into a mystery he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. The music had stopped. Now there was only the scratching, the watching, and the chilling whisper of the past seeping through the plaster. The scratching became the soundtrack to Mark's nights. It wasn't constant, but its sporadic persistence was worse. It would start just as he began to drift off, a jarring intrusion into the fragile peace he'd begun to rebuild. Scritch, scritch, this scritch, scritch, scritch. Each sound felt like a claw dragging down his raw nerves. He'd lie rigid, heart pounding, straining to pinpoint the exact location within the parlor wall. Whisper was his sentinel, always stationed outside the bedroom door, a small, dark shape facing the hallway, utterly still except for the occasional twitch of her tail tip. Her silence was more unnerving than any cry. Days bled into a tense routine. Mark avoided the front parlor like it was toxic. He'd walk past its closed door with averted eyes, a shiver tracing his spine. The piano sessions continued, but the joy was leached from them. When he played, it felt like shouting into a void, the notes brittle and anxious. Whisper still listened, sometimes humming softly, but her participation felt distracted, her mismatched gaze often drifting towards the hallway door instead of his hands. The shared warmth, the fragile duet, felt fractured under the weight of the unseen presence in the wall. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed relentlessly. Old Mrs. Abernethy. Mom died in the parlor. Mark found himself researching online late into scratch-haunted nights. Grief detection in animals. Animal behavior around death. Hauntings. The results were a confusing mix of scientific studies on acute animal senses and heart-wrenching anecdotes of pets mourning their owners, intertwined with wild paranormal speculation that made his skin crawl. None of it offered real answers, only deepened the chilling sense that Whisper was tuned into something he couldn't perceive, a frequency of sorrow embedded in the very plaster and laugh. He tried talking to her about it, sitting on the floor beside her during one of her silent vigils in the hallway, the dim light from the bedroom casting long shadows. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. "What do you hear? What do you know?" Whisper didn't look at him. Her amber eye remained fixed on the parlor door, her cloudy blue one seeming to stare into some middle distance. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a gesture of profound frustration or helplessness. Then she slowly closed her eyes in one of her deliberate, slow blinks. Mark blinked back, the familiar gesture of trust now layered with shared dread. "Okay," he breathed. "We'll figure it out." But he had no idea how. The breaking point came unexpectedly, not from the scratching, but from the mundane. A persistent drip developed in the bathroom faucet. A small thing easily ignored at first, but in the heightened tension of the house, the rhythmic plink, plink, plink became another nerve-shredding percussion against the backdrop of nightly scratching. It was the sound of decay, of things falling apart. Mark, frayed beyond endurance, finally called a plumber. Mr. Davies, a grizzled, no-nonsense man who'd serviced the house for years, arrived on a bleak, sleet-spitting afternoon. As Mr. Davies worked under the sink, grumbling about corroded washers, Mark hovered anxiously in the kitchen doorway. Whisper, unusually agitated, paced the hallway, her tail lashing. The plumber finished, packed his tools, and then, wiping his hands on a rag, gestured towards the front of the house. "While I'm here, Mark, you might want to know that damp patch on your parlor wall. The one shared with next door? Looks worse. Noticed it from outside. Water's gettin' in somewhere, likely from the flashing on the roof valley between the houses. Could be causing all sorts of mischief inside the wall cavity. Rot mold, critters." He shrugged. "Just a heads up. Might want to get it looked at before winter really bites." The damp patch. Mark had vaguely noticed it months ago, a faint, shadowy discoloration on the parlor wall near the ceiling, but had dismissed it, lost in his own fog of grief. Now, Mr. Davies's words struck him like a physical blow. Water getting in, mischief inside the wall cavity. Mold, critters. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't the grieving spirit of Marmalade. It was water. And where there was water damage, there could be structural weakness. There could be entry points. The implications crashed over him. The scratching, frantic, persistent. Could it be something trapped? Something alive? Not a phantom cat, but a real, terrified animal caught in the decaying space between the walls? The thought was horrifying. He imagined small claws scrabbling against wood and plaster, desperate for escape, weakening the structure further. Mrs. Henderson's story of Marmalade's cries took on a new, chillingly literal dimension. Had the old Tom somehow gotten trapped after his owner's death? Was history repeating itself? Mark felt sick. His avoidance, his fear of the room's echoes, might have condemned another creature to suffering. The weight of it, combined with the months of unresolved grief and the eerie tension, was suddenly unbearable. He had to know. He had to. As soon as Mr. Davies left, Mark stood in the hallway, staring at the parlor door. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat. Whisper sat at his feet, looking up at him, her posture rigid, expectant. Her amber eye held an intensity he hadn't seen before. Not fear. Urgency. Now it seemed to say, "Do it now." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air cold in his lungs. He pushed the door open. The parlor was frigid, the air stale and thick with dust. Weak, gray light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains. He ignored the covered furniture, the ghost of Clara's writing desk. His gaze locked onto the shared wall. The damp patch was indeed larger, a dark, spreading stain near the ceiling corner. And lower down, just above the baseboard, were faint marks. Scratches. Too high for a mouse. Too deliberate. Long, parallel grooves scored into the plaster. Whisper padded silently into the room behind him. She didn't hesitate at the threshold this time. She went straight to the wall, stopping directly beneath the damp patch and the scratches. She sat down, lifted her head, and let out a sound that froze Mark's blood. Not a hum. Not a growl. It was a low, guttural, heart-wrenching yowl. A sound of pure distress, echoing the imagined cries of Marmalade, echoing the frantic scratching. It was a plea. Loud, raw, and filled with a terrible knowing. That sound shattered the last of Mark's resistance. The grief, the fear, the helplessness, the guilt, it all coalesced into a single, desperate imperative. He had to get into that wall. He didn't think. He acted. He strode out of the parlor, down the hall to the cluttered utility cupboard under the stairs. He shoved aside brooms and paint cans, his hands trembling, until he found it, an old, heavy claw hammer he hadn't touched in years. Its weight felt alien, dangerous in his hands. He carried it back into the parlor, the cold metal a stark contrast to the frantic heat coursing through him. Whisper was still sitting by the wall, her yowl subsiding into a tense silence, her eyes fixed on him. Mark stood before the scratched plaster, the hammer heavy at his side. This was madness. He could be wrong. He could be destroying his house over a rodent or his own unraveling mind. But the image of something trapped, suffering, dying slowly in the dark, fueled by Whisper's haunting cry, overrode reason. He had to know. For his sanity. For whatever was behind that wall. He raised the hammer. The first blow was hesitant, a tentative thunk against the plaster. A small puff of dust bloomed. Whisper flinched but didn't move. He struck again harder. Plaster splintered. A jagged hole appeared. He struck again and again, widening the breach, his movements becoming more frantic, driven by a surge of adrenaline and dread. Chunks of plaster and lath fell away, revealing the dark cavity behind. The air that rushed out was cold, damp, and carried a stale, musty odor, the smell of decay, of trapped time. He stopped hammering, breathing hard, sweat cooling on his brow. He shone the flashlight he'd grabbed into the jagged opening. Dust motes danced in the beam. He saw the rough wooden studs of the wall frame. Saw crumbling insulation, dark with damp. Saw cobwebs thick as gauze. And then, deep in the shadows, tucked precariously between two studs near the floor, partly obscured by fallen plaster and damp insulation, he saw it. Not an animal. Not bones. It was a small, rectangular wooden box. Dark wood, warped with moisture, its surface scarred and stained. Tied around it with rotting twine was a single, desiccated sprig of lavender. It looked impossibly old, impossibly fragile, a relic hidden away for decades. Mark dropped the hammer. It hit the floorboards with a dull thud that echoed in the sudden, profound silence. He knelt, ignoring the grit biting into his knees, and reached carefully into the cavity. His fingers brushed the cold, damp wood. He gently worked the box free, its weight surprising him, feeling the fragile twine snap as he lifted it. He pulled it out into the dim light of the parlor. Whisper moved then. She didn't approach the hole. She padded silently to Mark's side as he knelt on the dusty floor. She sat down beside him, her body pressed lightly against his leg, her warmth a stark contrast to the chill emanating from the box. She looked at it, then slowly up at Mark, her mismatched eyes wide and unblinking. There was no fear in them now, only a deep, profound stillness. A waiting. Mark's hands trembled as he cradled the box. The damp had swollen the simple latch. He pried it open gently. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, nestled on faded, water-stained velvet, wasn't jewelry or money. It was a stack of yellowed sheet music. Handwritten. The notes were elegant, flowing, but the paper was brittle, the ink faded in places. On top lay a photograph. Black and white, its edges foxed. It showed a woman with kind, tired eyes and soft silver hair pulled back in a bun, sitting at a piano. On her lap, gazing up at her with rapt adoration, was a large, majestic ginger tomcat. Marmalade. And beside the woman, on the piano bench, was a small, gray kitten with a distinctive scar above one eye and mismatched eyes, one cloudy blue, one clear amber. Whisper. Or her ancestor. The resemblance was uncanny. Beneath the photo, tucked into the music, was a folded piece of notepaper. Mark unfolded it carefully, his breath catching. The handwriting was spidery, frail. For Marmalade's little shadow. She sings the songs he taught her, the ones I wrote for him. Keep them safe. Keep them singing. The music mustn't die with me. Abernathy. Mark stared at the words, then at the photo, then down at the small, gray cat pressed against his leg. Whisper looked back at him, then deliberately, slowly, closed both her eyes in a long, slow blink. A gesture of profound peace, of recognition, of a circle closing. He understood. The scratching hadn't been frantic claws. It had been whisper, driven by an instinct deeper than memory, perhaps by the lingering scent of her own lineage embedded in the house, by the faint vibrations of the piano playing her music. She had tried to reach this box. She tried to answer the echo of the songs contained within, songs written by Mrs. Abernathy for Marmalade, songs Whisper's ancestor had learned. Songs Whisper herself had been humming along to, not just with Mark, but with the ghosts of music past. Her strange singing wasn't just mimicry, it was inheritance. She'd been drawn to the wall because it held the tangible remnant of the music that was her birthright, hidden and decaying, crying out silently through the decades. The eerie moaning Mrs. Henderson heard? Whisper's frustrated attempts to reach the source of the music she felt but couldn't access. The phantom cries weren't Marmalade mourning, but the trapped legacy of his song. A sob tore from Mark's throat, raw and uncontrollable. It wasn't just the revelation. It was the crushing weight of shared grief, Mrs. Abernathy's for Marmalade, his own for Clara, converging in this dusty, broken wall. It was the impossible connection spanning decades, bound by music and the love for a cat. It was Whisper, this small, scarred creature, carrying the echo of another's song, leading him not to a ghost, but to a testament of enduring love and loss. He sank back onto his heels, the box cradled in his lap like a sacred relic. Whisper nudged his hand with her head, a soft, questioning sound rumbling in her throat. He looked down at her, tears blurring his vision. He saw the scar above her amber eye, mirroring the kitten in the photo. He saw her cloudy blue eye, holding the haze of time. He saw not just a cat, but a living bridge between past and present, grief and memory. He reached out not to the box, but to her. He buried his face in the soft fur of her neck, breathing in her familiar scent of dust and sunshine, feeling the steady vibration of her purr start up, deep and resonant against his cheek. It was the same purr that had comforted him in his darkest hours, the same purr that now vibrated with a profound sense of completion. They sat there, man and cat, on the dusty floor of the broken parlor, surrounded by debris and revelation. The scratching had stopped. The eerie tension had dissolved, replaced by a deep, resonant silence filled with the shared understanding of loss, legacy, and the unbroken thread of music. Mark held Whisper close, the box resting beside them, the faded notes waiting. The grief for Clara was still there, a vast ocean, but now, kneeling amidst the wreckage of the wall, holding the small, singing cat who had led him to this moment, Mark felt something else, something new, pierce the surface of his sorrow. A sense of profound, aching connection that transcended time and death. The music hadn't died. It had been waiting, hidden in the walls, carried in the heart of a one-eyed cat, ready to be found. And in finding it, Mark felt, for the first time in a year, that he wasn't just drowning in grief. He was part of a larger, enduring song. The box sat on the piano lid, its warped wood dark against Clara's emerald green shawl. Mark had cleaned it gently with a soft cloth, removing decades of dust and grime, revealing the intricate grain beneath. The lavender sprig, now brittle as ash, had crumbled when he untied it, leaving only a faint, ghostly scent clinging to the wood. The photograph of Mrs. Abernathy, Marmalade, and the tiny gray kitten, Whisper's ancestor, was propped against the box, watching over the room with quiet dignity. Whisper had changed. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing a stranger would notice, but Mark saw it. The tension in her shoulders had eased. She no longer paced the hallway at night, no longer stared fixedly at the parlor wall with that unsettling intensity. The scratching had stopped completely. It was as if finding the box had settled something deep within her, a restless itch finally soothed. She still sang, she still sang, but now it was different. Freer. Less like an echo searching for its source, and more like a voice finally singing its own song. Mark sat at the piano, the handwritten sheet music spread carefully before him. The pages were fragile, the ink faded in places, but the notes were still clear. Mrs. Abernathy's compositions were simple, heartfelt lullabies, mostly, and a few playful, lilting tunes that must have been written for Marmalade. Mark could almost picture the old woman sitting where he sat now, her fingers moving over the same keys, her ginger Tom curled beside her, the kitten, little shadow, watching with those same mismatched eyes. Whisper now turned on him. He played the first piece slowly, his fingers hesitating over the unfamiliar notes. It was a lullaby, soft and swaying, with a melody that felt like a sigh. He didn't expect Whisper to join in, not right away, but halfway through the second verse, she leaped onto the bench beside him. She didn't hum this time. She sang. A clear, sweet sound, weaving between the notes, harmonizing in a way she never had before. It wasn't mimicry. It was memory. Mark's breath caught. He kept playing, watching her from the corner of his eye. She sat upright, her tail curled neatly around her paws, her scarred face tilted towards the ceiling as if she were singing to something far beyond the room. The music filled the house, no longer trapped in the walls but alive, resonant, stitching together past and present in a way that made Mark's chest ache. When the song ended, Whisper blinked up at him, her amber eye bright, her blue one hazy with what looked like contentment. Then, as if deciding something, she butted her head against his forearm, once, firmly, before hopping down and padding out of the room, her tail held high. Mark exhaled, staring at the empty doorway. He felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but as if some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The grief was still there, still vast, but it no longer felt like drowning. It felt like standing in the ocean, the waves still rolling over him, but now he could breathe between them. The parlor wall was repaired, but not hidden. Mark hadn't covered the damage with a painting or a bookshelf. Instead, he'd framed the broken section, leaving the edges of the hole exposed, the layers of plaster and lath visible like the rings of a tree. Inside the cavity, before sealing it back up, he'd placed something new, a small, smooth stone from Clara's garden, a scrap of sheet music from one of his own compositions, and a single cat treat. Whisper had watched this process with intense interest, as if personally approving the offering. It wasn't a shrine. It was an acknowledgement, a way of saying, I see what was hidden here. I honor it. And now we move forward. The room itself felt different. Lighter. The heavy velvet curtains had been pulled back, letting in the weak winter sun. The dust had been swept away. The covered furniture remained. Mark wasn't ready to unveil it all yet, but the piano was no longer the only thing uncovered. Clara's writing desk, draped in its sheet for over a year, had been gently revealed. Mark ran his fingers over the smooth wood, tracing the scratches and ink stains she'd left behind. He didn't sit at it. Not yet. But he could look at it now without feeling like his ribs were cracking apart. Mrs. Henderson came over for tea. It was the first time Mark had invited anyone into the house since Clara's death. The old woman perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands wrapped around her cup, her eyes darting around the room with poorly concealed curiosity. You've opened up the parlor, she observed, nodding towards the hallway. Yes, Mark said simply. And the noises? Gone. Mrs. Henderson studied him over the rim of her teacup. You found something, didn't you? Mark hesitated, then nodded. He fetched the wooden box from the piano and set it on the coffee table between them. Mrs. Henderson's breath hitched when she saw the photograph. Oh, she whispered. Oh my. Her fingers hovered over the image, not touching, as if afraid it might dissolve. That's her. That's Mrs. Abernathy. And Marmalade. And, good heavens, is that your cat? Her ancestor, I think, Mark said. Same eyes. Same scar. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. Little Shadow, she murmured. She always had a kitten following her around. Marmalade's shadow, she called her. She looked up at Mark. Where was this? Inside the wall. Behind the plaster. The slow, knowing nod. She must have hidden it there. Before she passed. Mrs. Henderson touched the edge of the box reverently. She loved that cat more than anything. And he loved music. Used to sit right there on the bench with her while she played. Sang along too in his own way. She smiled faintly. Just like yours does. Mark swallowed. Did she write these? He gestured to the sheet music. Oh yes, she was a composer, you know. Not professionally. Just for love. Mrs. Henderson picked up one of the pages, her fingers trembling slightly. She used to say music was the only thing that kept her sane after her husband died. That and Marmalade. She met Mark's gaze, her eyes soft with understanding. I think she'd be glad her songs found their way to you. Mark looked down at the box, at the photograph, at the notes that had waited decades in the dark to be played again. He thought of Whisper, singing as if she'd known these melodies all her life. He thought of Clara, of the way she'd hum absent-mindedly while grading papers at that desk, of the way she'd always insisted on leaving the curtains open to let the light in. Yeah, he said quietly. I think she would. That night, for the first time in over a year, Mark dreamed of Clara. Not the Clara of the hospital bed, pale and fading. Not the Clara of his nightmares, slipping through his fingers like smoke. This was the Clara he'd married, laughing, vibrant, her hair catching the sunlight as she turned to say something over her shoulder. He couldn't hear her voice, couldn't make out the words, but it didn't matter. She was there. And she was smiling. He woke with tears on his face, but his chest didn't feel like it was caving in. The room was quiet, the pre-dawn light just beginning to seep through the curtains. And there, curled against his side, was Whisper, her small body a warm, steady weight. She lifted her head as he stirred, blinking at him with those mismatched eyes. Then, deliberately, she stretched one paw out and placed it on his chest, right over his heart. Mark covered her tiny paw with his hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath the fur. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But in that quiet, shared moment, he understood something fundamental. The music hadn't died. The love hadn't either. It had just been waiting to be found. The first snow fell quietly in the night, blanketing the world in hushed white. Mark woke to the peculiar stillness that only snow brings, the muffled absence of birdsong, the soft, heavy quiet pressing against the windows. Whisper was already up, perched on the sill, her nose nearly touching the glass as she watched the flakes drift past. When Mark shuffled into the room, yawning, she didn't turn. Her tail flicked once, a silent greeting, but her gaze remained fixed outside. He made coffee, the rich aroma mingling with the crisp, cold air seeping through the old window frames. The house felt different these days, not empty, but lived in again. The piano was no longer a monument to grief but a living thing, its keys worn smooth once more under his fingers. The sheet music from Mrs. Abernathy's box was neatly organized on the stand, the notes now as familiar to him as his own compositions. He played them often, sometimes with Whisper weaving her voice between the notes, sometimes alone, letting the melodies fill the spaces Clara had left behind. Whisper abandoned her vigil at the window and wound between his ankles as he poured his coffee. She'd put on weight these past few months, her storm gray fur thick and glossy, her movements less wary, more assured. The scar above her amber eye was just a pale thread now, barely noticeable unless the light caught it just right. She chirped at him, a sound that always reminded him of a question. Yeah, he murmured, bending to scratch behind her ears. I know. He pulled Clara's old wool coat from the hook by the door, the deep green one she'd loved, the one that still carried the faintest trace of her perfume in the folds. He'd started wearing it outside when the weather turned cold. At first, it had been because the heating was spotty in the workshop, and the coat was thick. Then it was because the sleeves were just the right length for his arms. Then it was because it made Whisper press her face into the fabric when he came back inside, as if she, too, found comfort in the lingering scent. Now, he wore it because it felt like carrying a piece of Clara with him. Not in a sad way. Not anymore. The workshop was a small, drafty outbuilding at the back of the property that had once been a potting shed. Clara had used it for her art, canvases stacked against the walls, jars of brushes and pencils scattered across every surface. After her death, Mark had closed the door and left it untouched for over a year. Then, one day in early December, he'd unlocked it, swept out the cobwebs, and started building something. A music box. Not just any music box. This one was special. He'd never been much of a woodworker, but grief had a way of making people try things they'd never considered before. He'd bought tools, watched tutorials, ruined more pieces of oak than he cared to admit. But slowly, painstakingly, the box had taken shape, small and sturdy, with dovetail joints and a hinged lid. Inside, he'd fitted a tiny, hand-cranked mechanism, the kind that could play a single, simple tune when the lid was opened. He'd chosen one of Mrs. Abernathy's lullabies, the first one he'd played after finding the box in the wall. The one Whisper had harmonized with so perfectly. Now, as he stepped into the workshop, his breath fogging in the cold air, he ran his fingers over the nearly finished piece. The wood was smooth under his palms, the edges sanded to a soft curve. All that was left was to carve something into the lid. He'd been putting it off, unsure what to etch there. A musical note? A cat? Clara's initials? Whisper, who had followed him out, leaped onto the workbench with effortless grace. She sniffed at the music box, then butted her head against his wrist, purring. "Yeah, I know," he said, stroking her back. "It's almost done." She blinked up at him, her mismatched eyes bright in the winter light filtering through the dusty window. Then, deliberately, she placed one paw on the lid of the box, right in the center. Mark stilled. He knew then what to carve. The snow continued to fall, gentle and relentless, as he worked. The workshop was freezing, his fingers stiff and clumsy, but he didn't stop. He used the finest chisel he had, the one meant for delicate details, and began to trace the shape into the wood, a single paw print, small and precise, the pads carefully defined, the claws just barely visible. Whisper's paw print. She watched him the entire time, her tail curled neatly around her feet, her gaze unwavering. When he finally sat back, blowing warmth into his numb fingers, she stretched forward and sniffed the carving. Then, to his surprise, she leaned in and licked his knuckle once, a quick, rough swipe of her tongue. Mark laughed, the sound startling in the quiet workshop. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that, unself-conscious, unfiltered. It felt like something breaking open inside him, something he hadn't realized was still clenched tight. Whisper chirped again, pleased with herself, and bumped her head against his arm. The music box was finished by New Year's Eve. Mark set it on the piano lid, beside Mrs. Abernathy's now empty wooden box. He hesitated, then slowly lifted the hinged lid. The mechanism clicked, the tiny metal teeth of the comb catching the pins of the cylinder, and the first notes of the lullaby spilled into the room, clear, sweet, and achingly familiar. Whisper, who had been dozing on the armchair, lifted her head. Her ears twitched forward. Then, without hesitation, she leaped onto the piano and padded over to the music box. She didn't sing this time. She just sat beside it, her tail curled around her feet, and listened. Mark listened too. The tune was simple, barely 30 seconds long, but it filled the house with something intangible, not just sound, but presence. Memory. The kind that didn't disappear even when the people, or the cats, who'd inspired it were gone. When the melody ended, Whisper reached out and tapped the lid with her paw, as if asking for an encore. Mark smiled and cranked the mechanism again. Later that night, as the snow continued to fall and the distant sound of fireworks popped and crackled in the town below, Mark sat at the piano, Whisper curled in his lap. He played softly, not one of Mrs. Abernathy's pieces, but something new, something of his own. It was rough, unfinished, but it felt right. Whisper purred, the vibration traveling through his legs, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, the world was quiet and white and still. Inside, the music played on. The piano bench creaked softly as Mark shifted, his fingers lingering on the keys. The last notes of his new composition, Whisper's lullaby, hung in the air, delicate as the winter sunlight filtering through the curtains. Beside him, the music box sat with its lid open, the tiny paw print carving gleaming under a thin layer of polish. It had become part of their daily ritual. Wake up, make coffee, play Mrs. Abernathy's melodies, then work on his own. Some days, the music flowed effortlessly. Other days, it was like pulling teeth. But he kept at it. For the first time in over a year, creating didn't feel like carving pieces out of his own ribs. It felt like breathing. Whisper, stretched across his lap like a furry, purring blanket, lifted her head and yawned. Her mismatched eyes, one amber, one milky blue, blinked up at him slowly. Again? They seemed to ask. Mark chuckled and scratched behind her ears. Yeah, all right. One more time. He began playing the lullaby again, this time softer, letting the notes melt together like snowflakes on warm skin. Whisper didn't sing along today. She just listened, her body a warm weight against his thighs, her tail flicking contentedly. It was strange, he thought, how grief worked. It never really left. It wasn't something you got over, like a cold or a bad breakup. It settled into your bones, became part of you. But it changed. The sharp, suffocating pain softened into something quieter, a bittersweet ache, a hollow space where love had been and still was, just in a different form. Clara's absence was still there, still vast. But so was her presence, in the way the light caught the dust motes over the piano, in the way Whisper curled up on her old writing desk like she was keeping it warm for her, in the way Mark could finally say her name without feeling like his ribs were cracking open. And Whisper had been the bridge. The small, scarred creature who'd wandered in from the rain and taught him how to listen again. Not just to music, but to the quiet spaces between the notes. To the things left unsaid. To the love that lingered in the walls, in the dust, in the paw prints left behind. The lullaby ended. Mark lifted his hands from the keys and let out a slow breath. Whisper stood, stretched, and hopped off his lap. She padded over to the music box and nudged the lid with her nose, sending the melody spinning into the air once more. Then she turned and trotted out of the room, tail held high, as if satisfied with her work. Mark watched her go, a smile tugging at his lips. He reached over and closed the music box gently, the last notes fading into silence. Outside, the snow had begun to melt. Thank you for joining Mark and Whisper's journey. If this story touched your heart, don't let the music stop here. Subscribe for more emotional, character-driven tales that feel real, where every pause, every glance, and every purr carries meaning. Comment below, did Whisper's singing remind you of a pet who changed your life? Have you ever felt a love that lingered in the walls? Share your story. Share this with someone who understands how grief and love can weave together into something beautiful. Press the bell icon so you never miss a story that makes you feel seen. Because sometimes the most extraordinary tales aren't about magic or monsters. They're about the quiet, purring moments that stitch us back together. Goodbye for now, but the music plays on.